Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we'll be taking a closer look at the rapidly changing world of geopolitics, specifically focusing on the relationship between the US, Russia, and China.
It's amazing how quickly things seem to be changing, you know? It's like someone hit the fast forward button on international relations and the old rules just don't apply anymore. Everyone's watching these developments unfold with a mix of anticipation and a good dose of anxiety.
Absolutely, especially when you consider the recent meeting between US and Russian officials in Saudi Arabia.
Oh yeah, that definitely raised some eyebrows, considering the relationship between those two has been pretty frosty lately.
Right. It kind of makes you wonder if a thaw might be on the horizon. But then you've got President Trump calling for peace in Ukraine while simultaneously labeling Ukrainian President Zelensky an unelected dictator.
Yeah, and let's not forget about the rather interesting deal he's pushing for Ukraine to pay the U.S. $500 billion.
Oh, yeah. And hand over control of their oil, gas, minerals, ports, infrastructure, you name it.
Yeah.
Oh, and 50% of their future export revenue, too.
It's certainly a bold proposition. Some might even call it economic colonialism.
I think that's putting it mildly. It's like a flashback to a bygone era of power politics. The thing that really gets me is that he blames Zelensky for the war, but then wants to impose such harsh terms on Ukraine.
Well, as Kissinger famously said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal.
Oof, that quote hits hard in this context. It really does make you think about the power dynamics at play on the global stage. And speaking of power dynamics, we can't forget about China's role in all of this.
Absolutely. It's clear that China's growing influence is a major factor in this whole geopolitical shakeup.
It seems like the U.S. is trying to play a delicate balancing act, trying to isolate China while also potentially warming up to Russia.
It's like they're trying to drive a wedge between those two countries despite their strong partnership.
Well, President Trump has openly talked about separating Russia and China. So it makes you wonder how serious he is about this whole peace with Russia thing.
I think a lot of people in China are skeptical of Trump's promises and are bracing themselves for increased aggression from the U.S.
That's understandable given the history. So is it safe to say that the U.S. is shifting its focus away from Russia and towards China?
That definitely seems to be the case. But I don't think it's about peace so much as it is about containing China.
Because they see China as the bigger threat to their global dominance.
Exactly. They see China as a rival in every sense of the word, militarily, economically, technologically, you name it.
And they're not afraid to use all the tools at their disposal to try and slow China's rise.
We've seen them impose tariffs on Chinese goods and try to restrict the growth of Chinese tech companies like TikTok and Huawei.
It's almost like a new Cold War is brewing, but this time with China instead of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and this time the stakes are even higher. The global economy is far more interconnected, and the technological race is moving at warp speed.
So how do the U.S. and China view this emerging multipolar world? Are they on the same page at all?
Not really. The U.S. seems to see multipolarity as a zero-sum game, a competition between great powers for spheres of influence.
So basically, it's all about who gets the biggest slice of the pie.
Pretty much. But China has a very different vision. They talk about a world without imperialism where all countries have an equal voice and can participate in global decision-making on a level playing field.
So China is advocating for a more equitable and cooperative world order.
That's their stated goal, at least.
Yeah.
But it remains to be seen how that plays out in practice.
It's a stark contrast to the U.S.'s more competitive approach. And no wonder there's so much tension.
And that tension is playing out on multiple fronts.
Yeah.
The U.S. is trying to weaken China economically through tariffs and sanctions.
Yeah, those tariffs have been making headlines for a while now. It seems like they're trying to hit China where it hurts, but also maintain some semblance of a trade relationship.
It's a delicate balancing act, for sure. And they've also been targeting Chinese tech companies like TikTok and Huawei, trying to stifle their growth and technological advancement.
It's like they're playing a game of whack-a-mole, trying to squash any challenge to their power wherever it pops up.
And this strategy of containing China has bipartisan support in the U.S. Both Democrats and Republicans see China as a threat and want to limit its influence.
So it seems like President Trump is just another player in this larger geopolitical game.
Well, despite his rhetoric about making deals and being friendly with China, his actions often tell a different story.
Yeah, he has a long history of military intervention and aggression. And his economic policies, like those tariffs, have actually strengthened the U.S. dollar, which goes against his stated goal of reindustrializing the U.S.
So it seems like there's a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability in the U.S.'s approach to China. They're sending mixed signals, and it's making a lot of countries nervous.
Yeah, it's hard to know what to expect from them these days. It's like they're trying to hold on to the old world order while simultaneously trying to shape the new one.
And that's creating a lot of anxiety and uncertainty on the global stage. People are wondering who they can trust and what the future holds.
Well, it's definitely a time of transition and change, and it's going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
Yeah.
But I have a feeling we'll be talking about this for a long time to come.
Oh, absolutely. This is just the beginning of a much larger story that's going to unfold over the coming years and decades.
So buckle up, everyone. It's going to be a wild ride.
You got that right. It's like we're watching the tectonic plates of global power shifting right before our eyes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it does feel like we're in the middle of a slow motion earthquake where like tremors are happening all around us, but we're not even sure where the fault lines are yet.
It's a perfect analogy. Old certainties are crumbling and we're entering a period of immense transition. It's exciting and unsettling all at the same time.
So in this massive reshuffling of global power, who stands to benefit?
The countries that can adapt to this changing landscape, the ones who can ride the waves, so to speak, will be the ones to thrive.
It's like surfing. You either catch the wave or you wipe out.
Exactly. And right now, that wave is heading straight for multipolarity, a more decentralized world with multiple centers of power and influence.
That's a big shift from the US-dominated world we've grown accustomed to for so long. What happens when the policeman retires? Does the world just descend into chaos?
Not necessarily. It could actually lead to a more stable and equitable world order if it's done right. A multipolar world could mean more cooperation and less conflict as countries are forced to work together.
Because they can't just rely on the US to solve all their problems or dictate the terms of engagement.
Precisely. It would force countries to find common ground to negotiate solutions that benefit everyone rather than just one dominant power.
That sounds almost utopian. But let's be real. The world can be a pretty messy place. Is a truly multipolar world even achievable?
It won't be easy, that's for sure. But we're already seeing signs of this shift happening. The growing influence of BRICS, the emergence of regional power, blocks the increasing assertiveness of developing nations. It's all pointing in that direction.
So how is the US reacting to this shift? Are they embracing the change or digging in their heels?
It's a bit of both, to be honest. On one hand, they're trying to adapt by forging new alliances and shifting their strategic focus. But on the other hand, they're still trying to cling to their old power, using economic and military pressure to get their way.
It's like they're trying to hold on with one hand while reaching for something new with the other.
That's a great way to put it. They're in a state of limbo, stuck between the world that was and the world that's emerging. And that creates a lot of uncertainty and anxiety, not just for them, but for everyone.
So what can the US do to navigate this transition successfully? Do they have to completely relinquish their global dominance?
They have a lot to offer the world in terms of innovation technology and economic power, but they need to adapt to this new reality. They need to learn to work within a multipolar system.
So less dictating and more collaborating.
Exactly. They need to embrace a more cooperative approach to global governance, working with other nations as equals to address common challenges. If they don't, they risk becoming increasingly isolated and irrelevant.
That's a tough pill to swallow for a country that's used to calling the shots, especially given the current political climate in the US. There's so much division and distrust, both domestically and internationally.
You're not wrong. And there's always the risk that a renewed push for U.S. dominance could backfire, leading to more resentment and resistance from other countries.
So it's a high-stakes gamble with no guaranteed outcome.
Precisely. And then there's a third possibility, the one that keeps me up at night.
I don't like the sound of this. What's the third scenario?
What if this trend toward multipolarity, instead of leading to greater cooperation, actually leads to increased competition and conflict? What if it ultimately escalates into a major global war?
A World War III scenario. You're talking about a full-blown global conflict.
It's a chilling thought, I know. But we can't just bury our heads in the sand. We're already seeing a rise in military spending, the development of new and terrifying weapons technologies, and growing tensions between major powers. It's a recipe for disaster.
And those tensions are already playing out in places like Ukraine, the South China Sea, the Middle East. It feels like the world is a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
And that spark could come from anywhere, a miscalculation, an accident, a deliberate act of aggression. We're living in a very dangerous time.
So we're teetering on the brink of disaster. Is there any hope for a peaceful and cooperative future, or is conflict inevitable?
There's always hope, but it requires a conscious effort from all nations to choose diplomacy over aggression, to build trust, and to work together to address common challenges.
It sounds like a tall order, especially given the current state of global affairs. How do we even begin to bridge the divides and overcome the deep-seated mistrust that exists between nations?
It won't be easy, that's for sure. But we have to try. We have to find ways to communicate, to build empathy, to see each other not as enemies, but as fellow inhabitants of this fragile planet.
It's a message of hope, but also a call to action. We can't just sit back and wait for things to get better. We have to be active participants in shaping the future we want.
Exactly. We need to educate ourselves about the forces shaping our world, engage in constructive dialogue, and demand that our leaders prioritize peace and cooperation over conflict and division.
Well said. We can't just leave it to the politicians and diplomats to figure this out. It's up to all of us to create a more peaceful and just world.
Absolutely. The future is not predetermined. It's something we create together through our choices and actions.
Okay, we've talked about the big picture, the global power shift, and the potential for both cooperation and conflict. Now let's zoom in a bit. What are some of the specific tools and tactics the U.S. is using to try and maintain its influence in this changing world?
That takes us into the realm of geoeconomics, the use of economic instruments to achieve geopolitical objectives.
It sounds a bit like weaponizing the economy.
In a way, it is. And the U.S. has a whole arsenal of economic weapons at its disposal. They've got tariffs, sanctions, investment restrictions, you name it.
We've already talked about tariffs. Those
Right.
taxes on imported goods that the U.S. has been using to protect domestic industries and punish countries that don't play by their rules.
Right. And then there are sanctions, which are essentially economic penalties imposed on countries for their actions. Think of them as a way to punish bad behavior or try to force a change in policy.
And those sanctions can be pretty devastating, right? They can cripple economies and cause widespread suffering.
They absolutely can. They're a blunt instrument for sure, but they can be very effective in putting pressure on countries to change their behavior.
But they can also backfire, right? If you push a country too hard, they might just dig in their heels and become even more defiant.
That's always a risk. And we've seen it happen in cases like Iran and North Korea. Sanctions can also have unintended consequences, like hurting ordinary citizens more than the government they're intended to punish.
So it's a delicate balancing act. The U.S. has to weigh the potential benefits of sanctions against the risks and costs. And in a multipolar world, that calculation becomes even more complex.
Exactly. The U.S. can't just bully other countries into submission anymore. Those countries have more options now. They can turn to other partners like China or Russia for support if they feel like they're being unfairly targeted.
It's like the world is saying, we don't need your money or your rules anymore.
And that's a direct challenge to U.S. economic power. The U.S. dollar has been the dominant global currency for decades, but that dominance is being challenged as we speak.
So are we headed for a world with multiple currencies vying for supremacy? A kind of currency war?
It's certainly a possibility. We're already seeing the emergence of regional currencies like the euro and the yuan, and the development of alternative payment systems that bypass the U.S.-controlled SWIFT network.
So it's a bit of a Wild West out there with everyone trying to stake their claim in the new global economic order. What does this mean for the average person trying to make sense of all this?
It means we're living in a time of great uncertainty and volatility. The old rules are breaking down and new ones are being written, and it's going to have a profound impact on everyone's lives.
Okay, so we've talked about geoeconomics. Now let's talk about the other big elephant in the room, military power. The U.S. still has the most powerful military in the world by far. How are they using that power in this new multipolar landscape?
The U.S. has traditionally relied on its military might to project power and influence around the globe. But as we've discussed, that approach is becoming less effective in a multipolar world.
Because other countries are catching up militarily, and they're less willing to be intimidated by U.S. firepower.
Precisely. And the U.S.'s recent military adventures, like the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, have shown the limits of military power. These wars have been costly, both in terms of lives and treasure, and they haven't achieved their stated objectives.
So the U.S. military machine is starting to look a bit rusty.
The U.S. military is still a formidable force, but they're facing new challenges and adapting their strategies accordingly. They're shifting away from large-scale ground wars and towards a more nimble and flexible approach that relies on air power, special forces, and cyber warfare.
So less boots on the ground and more drones in the sky.
In a nutshell, yes. And they're also focusing on developing new technologies like hypersonic missiles and artificial intelligence to maintain their military edge. They know they can't afford to fall behind in the technological arms race.
It sounds like they're trying to stay ahead of the curve, but the competition is getting fiercer.
Exactly. The U.S. is determined to maintain its military superiority, but it's facing increasingly sophisticated competitors like China and Russia. The stakes are higher than ever.
So the U.S. is trying to adapt to this new multipolar reality, both economically and militarily. But it's a bumpy ride, and the outcome is far from certain.
That's the reality of living in a world in transition. The old order is crumbling and a new one is taking shape. And it's up to us to understand these shifts and navigate them as best we can.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed by all of this. It's a lot to process.
It is indeed. But it's also incredibly fascinating to witness these historical shifts unfolding in real time. And it's more important than ever to stay informed and engaged with the world around us.
Because the decisions made in the coming years will shape the world we live in for generations to come.
Absolutely. The stakes are high, and the choices we make will have far-reaching consequences. But I remain optimistic. I believe that if we work together, we can create a more peaceful, just, and sustainable future for all.
So we've talked about a lot in this deep dive, from the shifting dynamics of global power to the challenges of a multipolar world and the potential for both cooperation and conflict.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey, exploring these complex forces that are shaping our world and the choices we face as a global community.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this episode, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on potential future scenarios. What are some possibilities that could play out on the global stage?
Well, one possibility is a continuation of the trend toward multipolarity, a gradual decline in U.S. dominance, and the rise of other power centers like China, the EU, India, and the BRICS nations.
So a world where power is more evenly distributed, no single superpower calling all the shots.
Exactly. It could potentially lead to more cooperation and less conflict as countries are forced to work together to solve global problems.
That sounds promising. But I imagine a multipolar world comes with its own set of challenges. What are some potential downsides?
For sure. It could also lead to more instability and competition as these different power centers vie for influence and resources. And we can't rule out the risk of regional conflicts escalating into global ones.
So it's not a guaranteed path to peace and harmony. It's more like a balancing act with both risks and rewards.
Right. It's a complex and evolving system with opportunities and challenges.
Okay, so that's one possible scenario. What are some other paths we could take?
Another possibility, though, perhaps less likely, is a resurgence of U.S. dominance.
A comeback for the American empire.
Well, it's not impossible. The U.S. still has a lot of strengths, a powerful military, a dynamic economy, and a network of global alliances. But it would require a significant shift in strategy and a willingness to cooperate with other nations.
That might be tough, given the current political climate in the U.S. There's a lot of division and distrust, both domestically and internationally.
Yeah, that's true. And there's also the risk that such a push for renewed dominance could backfire and provoke even more resentment and resistance from other countries.
This deep dive has been both eye-opening and thought-provoking. We've explored the shifting dynamics of global power, the challenges of a multipolar world, and the potential for both cooperation and conflict. As we conclude, I'm left with a sense of urgency and possibility. We're at a crossroads, and the decisions we make today will have a profound impact on the world of tomorrow.
Well said. It's been a fascinating exploration. We've delved into the intricate workings of geopolitics and glimpsed the potential futures that lie ahead.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the ever-evolving landscape of global affairs.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you and our listeners.
Don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more insightful explorations of the forces shaping our world. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.